Last week, or last episode rather, we began to ask the question, does a Calvinist reading of Romans chapter 9 as support for the Calvinist doctrine of unconditional election, does it hold up in dialogue with a non-Calvinist? And I was joined by two guests, one of them Calvinist, one of them Arminian, and we began to discuss that question. We continue to discuss that question with the same two guests in today's episode of Theopologetics. Hi, this is Chris Date, and welcome to Theopologetics, where every other week I discuss a wide variety of theological issues and show how a properly biblical worldview can help defend the historic Christian faith from its critics. Join me as we think through what we believe and why we believe it, and not something else. So this past weekend, or no, not this past weekend, but the weekend before, was our 7th annual Rethinking Hell conference, which went off without a hitch. It was a fantastic event, one of the best conferences I think that we've had so far. If you weren't able to make it, but you would still like to access the recordings sooner than we make them available to the wider public, consider going to patreon.com/rethinkinghell, and you can sign up to be a patron, and that will grant you access to those recordings here within the next few days. We're just weaving the slides and stuff into the recordings right now, and so those will be up real soon. It was a fantastic event, and I won't go into details right now, but I'll ask you for your prayers. A book opportunity arose as a result of that conference. Probably the most compelling book proposal that I have had. Those of you who have known me for some time know that I tried to pitch a book proposal to some big publishers, Baker Academic, Zondervan Academic, IVP Academic, and some others. I've done that a few times and have always gotten shot down because, for one reason or another, but usually the main reason is because of my lack of a terminal degree. But the opportunity that arose at the conference is one that I'm hopeful and optimistic will be received more favorably than those past ones. So if you'd keep me in your prayers, I'd appreciate it. I'm not going to say any more about it than that, but be on the lookout for additional announcements if I'm able to secure a publisher, and then I'll be able to tell you all about it. But anyway, that went really well, and I was also really pleased with the discussion that I had last episode of Theopologetics between my friend Robert Wiesner, who's a Calvinist, and my I'll count him a friend now, Dan Chapa, who is an Arminian. The conversation went really well, and I'm looking forward to continuing that discussion today. If you haven't already watched that conversation, then you might want to not watch this episode right now live, or if you're watching on demand, don't go watch it, stop this recording, go watch the previous episode 7 of Theopologetics, so that you can see the first half of the discussion that we're going to be continuing in today's episode. Like last time, the episode was recorded in advance. The discussion was recorded in advance. I'm talking to you live right now. In fact, I'll say hi in the chat just to prove that it is me. But the recording of the discussion, or the discussion itself, was pre-recorded, and I'm going to air that in just a minute. But I will try to interact here and there in the chat during the conversation. After this episode's over, or after the discussion's over, I'll come back in and I'll bid you adieu. Maybe I can field a question or two before I do. And then 2 weeks from today, I will do a topic in which I'll be teaching the whole time live. It won't be a pre-recorded discussion or anything. And I'm thinking that what I'll cover is the millennium of Revelation chapter 20, and I'll be offering an amillennialist reading of Revelation 20. If you have watched the episode of Theopologetics a few episodes ago where I introduced you to the topic of preterism, you recall that the preterism, futurism, historicism, idealism debate is just one of multiple eschatological debates within Christianity, another one of which is premillennialism, postmillennialism, and amillennialism. And I am an amillennialist, but I have an unusual, an uncommon reading of Revelation 20, the millennium there, that doesn't exactly line up with other typical amillennialist readings. And in fact, I'll go so far as to say that the more popular amillennialist reading has less going for it than the premillennialist reading. It just so happens that my amillennialist reading is even better than that. So if you're interested, hopefully that gives you a little bit of a tease. Hopefully it gets you to come back here in 2 weeks. But I'll just leave it there. And because the discussion goes on for just about as long as it did in the previous episode, I'll go ahead and stop blabbering my mouth and go ahead and continue with my discussion, round 2 of my discussion with Robert Wiesner and Dan Chapa, discussing whether or not Romans chapter 9 supports a conditionalist reading, whether or not Romans 9 supports the Calvinist doctrine of unconditional election. Enjoy. Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Theopologetics. My name is Chris Date, and I'm continuing my discussion from last episode with my friends and guests Robert Wiesner and Dan Chapa. We were talking last episode about Romans 9 and whether in that chapter Paul supports either implicitly or otherwise the doctrine of Calvinistic unconditional election. My friend and guest Robert Wiesner is a Calvinist and is defending the notion that it does, and my friend and guest Dan Chapa is an Arminian and is arguing that it does not. Now, I want to explain where we're going to be going in today's episode. By the way, just as a side note for viewers who might be wondering why I look so different from last time, it's because, number one, I've lost my glasses in the past couple of days, and so I've got this bare face that I don't normally have. And then number two, my wireless earbuds, I forgot to charge them since last episode, and so I've got to wear these big clunky things. So I apologize in advance if my appearance is jarring, but the way I see it, my appearance is usually jarring. Anyway, but that having been said, let me explain the directions that we're going to go today, what we're going to cover today. First, I want to continue the discussion from where we left off last time. Actually, you know what? Before I explain where we're going to go, I should probably introduce my guests. So let me do that really quick. Robert, thanks. You've now been on the show twice. This will be your third time. And of course, you and I have interacted in other venues as well. It's a pleasure to have you on. Thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's good to be back digging into the text again with Dan. I just want to say that I know he's not reprobate because he's wearing a Dallas Cowboys shirt today. So we're on the same page with that. Regardless of our differences, at least we can agree in lamenting the Cowboys season thus far, but hoping for a brighter future. So, yeah.
From as far as I'm concerned, you're both reprobate for giving a lick about football when what really matters is hockey. But that having been said, so let me turn now and welcome my other guest and friend, Dan Chapa. Dan, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great this morning. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be back and speaking with both you guys, and just happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. All right, now let me explain to viewers where we're going to be going today. First, we're going to pick up where we left off last time, which is a discussion about whether Paul's emphatic statements that it isn't based on human willing or exertion, whether that has to do with the fact or process of being saved. In other words, you being saved is not at all dependent upon any act of your own human will or exertion, or whether instead it's the plan of salvation, the decision to make salvation available to anyone who believes, whether that itself is not based on any human will or exertion. That's where we left off last time. We're going to continue with the discussion on that. Then we'll turn to Paul's discussion of, or his use of Pharaoh, leading into his hypothetical objection in verse 19, which is often argued to be sort of the crux for determining whether Paul has in mind something like unconditional election. And then finally, we'll turn to what we'll spend the majority of our time on, which is Paul's use of the potter-clay analogy, which is his answer to the hypothetical objection that he raises. So that's sort of the terrain for the ground, or the map of the terrain we're going to cover today. And with that introduction out of the way, I'll go ahead and get us started. So, Dan, I want to start with you. Last time we left off our discussion talking about Paul's emphatic statements in Romans 9 that it doesn't depend on human willing or exertion. And it was Robert's in my understanding that precludes the notion that the person who is being saved, that person's salvation depends in any way on his or her human willing and exertion. But you propose the possibility that, in fact, what isn't based on human willing or exertion is the plan of salvation. That is, we cannot will God or strong arm God into making salvation available to specific groups of people. Maybe we can't tell God, hey, you should only save Jews, or you should only save Gentiles, or you should save anybody who merits it, or you shouldn't, or whatever. We don't get to tell God how to decide whom to save and on what conditions. That's entirely his prerogative. Do you want, if I'm understanding that correctly, or even if I'm not, maybe you can unpack that a little bit and just to get the ball rolling and give us some stuff to talk about. Elaborate a bit on what you see Paul meaning when he talks about it not depending on human willing or exertion.
Thank you. And actually, that was quite accurate. So that's great. I was able to get a little bit of my point across, which is helpful. So when you take the expression sola fide, right, and you just boil it down to its very essence, by grace through faith, here Paul is narrowing his focus even further to by grace. Right. And he's focused on God's grace, which is a free gift. It's not only unearned, but it's also unconditioned. So when we talk about the plan of salvation, it's not as if our faith is why God sent his son to die on the cross, right, and offer salvation to believers. So in 1 Corinthians, when it says, God chose to save through the foolishness of preaching those who believe, that choice wasn't conditioned on those who believed. God just freely did that. Likewise, in 1 Peter, when he talks about his son that's foreordained before the foundation of the world, right? That's not based on our faith. So none of that is based on faith. Now, the only limitation that I put on it is we can't interpret Romans 9:15 or 15 and 16 in a way that contradicts sola fide, but I don't think here he's doing that. He's talking more broadly about the plan of salvation, and God can save whoever he believes. Now, and one last point that I'll make is God could have chosen any way or any group to save, anyone or any way. He chose to save through faith, but that's not in the text here. But here he's stamping his absolute sovereignty that it's up to him. But just to make this point a little more clear, God could have chosen, let's say, covenantal nomism as the plan of salvation, but he didn't do that. He chose to save through faith.
Okay, now, Robert, I want to ask you for your thoughts on that, but I just wanted to observe that this sounds similar to the discussion that we Calvinists and non-Calvinists have around Ephesians 2:8, right? So in Ephesians 2:8, Paul says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works." And some, I think, less informed Calvinists have sometimes, including myself before I became more familiar with what it is that I believe and why, have argued that what Paul is saying is the gift of God and is not your own doing, is the faith through which we have been saved in that first part of verse 8. But as Greek grammarians will point out, the thing that is not your own doing and is the gift of God does not match the gender of the word faith. Faith is feminine, whereas the pronoun "this is not your own doing, it is a gift of God," that's neuter. And so this has been argued by non-Calvinists to mean that it's the whole shebang, the whole by grace you have been saved through faith, that whole thing that is not your own doing, it is a gift of God, whether or not your faith itself, which brings you into the scope of salvation, is your own doing, is not something that this text is precluding. I think that's interesting. But Robert, what would you say in response to Dan's explanation of the not willing and exerting part of Romans 9?
Yeah, it's obviously true that God isn't strong-armed into, what we might call a plan of salvation, where, the conditions are something that he doesn't get to assign or something like that. Like, obviously, we agree on that God establishes the condition. That's absolutely true. What we disagree on is whether or not that's relevant to what Paul actually argues here in Romans 9. And this is why I think the discussion that we had before, Chris, on the grammar and trying to understand what's emphatic by looking at Paul's Greek is so important. So if you look at beginning in verse 15, where he draws on the allusion to Exodus 33:19, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. That's in a section where it's sort of like the first remnant text of the Old Testament, where God saves a group within the people of Israel, while they're all, the text says, stiff-necked and idolatrous, and God determines that he's going to save this people, even though they all deserve his judgment. God is right to want to wipe out the nation. He determines to save them, and that's the inference that Paul draws from that. And he uses these participles that express like this gnomic sense, and it's talking about individuals. What type of person does Paul think that God has mercy on? Not the individual, right? This is a substantival participle, not the willing one, not the striving one, but it's contingent on God, who is the mercying God, right? The God who has mercy. And then we get, again, in verse 18, I will have mercy, or on whom I will have mercy, and I will harden whom I will harden. So the idea here, or he hardens whom he wills, and he has mercy on whom he wills. So Paul's whole point here is about God's mercy extended to one Israelite and not to another. This isn't about plans of salvation versus other conceivable plans of salvation. This is about God being merciful to one and hardening others. The same lump, we're going to get into the potter clay analogy later. I think it refers to Israel. And this is where it's also important to pay attention carefully to this language of the will here. You know, Dan raised this a couple times last time, and again about, we need to see this consistently with sola fide. And I'm like, yeah, but we're not talking about sola fide here. We're looking back at election, calling, mercy, which I think Romans 8, 28 through 30 places as prior to justification. Sola fide is about justification. We're getting back behind justification here in Romans 9 to ask, why is it that most Israelites do not believe in Jesus? And when we look at Paul's language, and he talks about the divine will versus the human will, he only shoots down the human will, verse 16, and is not according to the one who wills. But then throughout the rest of the text, it's about upholding the divine will, even with regard to the extending of mercy to individuals. And so, that would be my response. I just don't think that is tethered tightly enough to the text. I think we can affirm and agree on a lot that's true, but it just gets really quickly away from the weeds of Paul's argument.
Before I turn back to you, Dan, I want to push back a little bit and try to play the devil's advocate, or the Arminian's advocate, as it were, and ask, so it seems to me that an Arminian or any other non-Calvinist could affirm what you just said about the emphasis on the Paul's emphasis being on the mercy shown to a group of people rather than mercy being a reflection of a plan of salvation. And what they could say is that it's similar. So take how they explain corporate election. They would say that God elects a people, but the people that he elects is a group into which people place themselves via their faith. Now, I'm not saying I accept that notion. I don't think that's a good explanation for the election language, but let's say that it is. Well, then what Paul may be saying is that indeed God will have mercy on whom he will have mercy. He will have compassion on whom he will have compassion. But the one upon whom he has mercy or compassion is this group into which people, by their will, add themselves or remove themselves. It seems to me like that is arguably a plausible way of applying it. If Dan were to go that route, and we'll turn to him for a second to see if that has anything to do with what he would say, how would you respond to that, Robert? Is it possible that what you said can be true, and nevertheless people make themselves by their own will part of this group upon whom God has mercy?
I don't think it is. So, we use that language of will. Again, the human will is only shot down. This is the verb thelo. It appears a few times as a verb and once as a participle, the one who wills, to thelantos in verse 16. And there it is to say it's not according to human willing, right? And the point that Paul is making is that it's the divine will that has mercy, and his mercy is connected to this calling that creates the covenant people. And when we get into the potter clay language, we might have time to talk a little bit more about this. I definitely want to get into the Second Temple Jewish literature, but I think Paul's language is closest with regard to his mercy language and this potter clay analogy to Jewish writers who use it to describe the way that God transfers somebody into the covenant community. It's not his response to their aligning themselves with the covenant community, but God's moving people by a call, by his mercy, and forming this covenant people in this way. So I think that that is a common explanation, but I think it's the opposite of the argument that Paul is making. I think Paul is saying that God's call and God's mercy creates the covenant community, and that community is a saved community. We could talk about corporate election in that way, but the question is, what's the ultimate cause of one being brought into that? I think when we examine Paul's predestination and election language in its Jewish milieu, it's actually there's a real strong case, as I've argued elsewhere, that he sees it as that predestinarian kind of election that brings individuals into that corporate elect community.
All right. So, well then, Dan, let's. I'm interested to hear how you would continue this argument, or this. Yeah. How would you respond to what Robert has here laid out as an argument for thinking that what doesn't depend on human will or exertion is even the very decision to be a recipient of God's mercy, by faith.
Sure. So for starters, in terms of the plan of salvation, the way I see it, not to rehash the past, but if you look at the opening presentation I gave, I stressed sola fide and how it's in Romans 9 and the role that it plays in Romans 9. And the opposite side of that is the covenantal nomism, the Jews basically thinking that the plan of salvation was through ethnicity and the works of the law, and so the debate essentially was sola fide versus works of the law, and you can see that building up. And I think that is the objection in verse 14. Is there injustice on God's part? Could be translated unrighteousness on God's part, and meaning not being faithful to his covenant promises to the nation of Israel. So that's why I kind of see it as the plan of salvation, and that is the main difficulty I have with many of the big Calvinist commentators like Moo and Schreiner and things like that, because they don't tell us what sola fide is doing here. They know that it's there, but they don't know what it's doing there. So
let's get.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, Robert.
So you get justification language brought up again by the time we get to verse 30, but that's a new pericope. I think it's a new step in Paul's argument. Of course, we need to see Romans 9 to 11 as a single unit, right? But here we're not talking. So if we want to say, and this is what I think Moo and Schreiner are getting at, if we want to say that justification by faith is lingering in the background, well, of course, like that's what Romans is all about, right? Like that's Paul's thesis from the get-go in chapter 1, 16 and 17. But again, that's why I've said what we're doing is having laid out his case for justification on the basis of Christ-oriented faithfulness rather than law-oriented works. He now gets in to answer the question, why is it that the Jewish people do not believe? And so he's getting behind belief. He's getting behind justification into the world of election, calling, mercy, right? Where he says that God creates his people, names them even before they were born or had done anything good or evil, to go back to the Jacob and Esau illustration that Paul draws on as a type of what's going on with Israel in his day. So I think that we're not. Yeah, I just think that this is laying something over Paul's argument at this point that doesn't seem to be what he's trying to do at this point. He's trying to give explanation for why they're not justified by faith, and to do that he appeals to the divine will with regard to mercy, even though he holds out, emphatically, adamantly, their responsibility for not believing as we get into 9:30 and through 10. But even there, he talks about that being part of the divine plan. So, yeah, I just don't think that really works in following Paul's argument closely, Dan.
So the way it would be an interesting exercise one day. We could just take Romans 9 and you take a yellow highlighter and a blue highlighter, and I'll do the same, and we'll highlight which aspects are talking about the nation of Israel, and which aspects are talking about salvation. Right? I think what we'd find is different highlights on different spots. And the reason why I see more aspects about salvation in some things focused on the nation of Israel as they are is because I see sola fide playing a major role. Now, obviously it's there, Calvinist commentaries say it's there, but I just think we see it functioning different. So anyways, I'll leave it at that.
Before we leave it there, Dan, let me ask you a question that occurs to me. It's interesting, this passage in Exodus 33, where Yahweh tells Moses, "I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and show mercy on whom I will show mercy." It's interesting that it isn't immediately clear in its context what Yahweh is trying to say there. I mean, I think it's close enough in proximity to Moses' intercession for his people that he's saying, I will show mercy to Israel because I've chosen to show mercy to Israel, or something along those lines. Or I suppose arguably it could be that he's saying I'll be gracious to you, Moses, because Moses has just been saying, I want to know that you will be with me, that you'll show me favor. So, I mean, arguably there, it could be what he's saying. But either way, it seems to me as if what Yahweh is saying in that original context in Exodus 33 is that he will be gracious and show mercy to individuals, specific people that he will choose to be gracious to and show mercy to. For example, the people of Israel are not a group of people into which people by their choice enter into, with the arguable exception of the very rare occasional convert to Israel, right? So my question for you then, before we move on to the next part of Romans 9, is, if I'm right about that, if in its original context God is talking about showing mercy to a specific people and not to a group of people into which people may or may not choose to enter, then how wouldn't that seem to lend support to Robert's and my reading of Paul's words in Romans 9, where he cites that verse?
I think I understand your point, and in some sense, maybe I'm looking at it slightly more abstracting the principle of God's sovereignty and being able to choose whoever he wants out of the specifics of, I'm going to show mercy to Bob and Tim and Sue and not Sarah and Jane and Mike, right? So I think that's probably accurate. That Paul is probably just drawing that principle out rather than those specifics. But I think more broadly, right? This is in the Golden Calf incident, obviously, and the law was broken, right? The Sinaitic covenant was broken, and more law keeping isn't going to fix the problem. What's now is needed is mercy, and I think that's the centrality of Paul's point. Hopefully, we can agree on at least on that much.
Okay. All right. Well, it's the very next verse after, I will show mercy to whom I will show mercy, that he then in verse 17, it's in the very next verse after it's Paul saying it doesn't depend on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. That was verse 16. It's in the very next verse that Paul then cites God's words to Pharaoh in Exodus 9:16, "For this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." Now, it seems, I think, to Calvinist readers like me, that in its original context and as Paul is using it here, the idea is that everything in Pharaoh's life was orchestrated sovereignly, to use a little bit of a loaded term, by God to get Pharaoh to the point and then where he is in authority over Egypt and he is enslaving the Jewish people. And then when God brings Moses in its original context, it seems as if God is hardening Pharaoh's heart so that God can demonstrate his power, lest Pharaoh free the Israelites before God has had his chance to demonstrate his power. In other words, it seems to me as if Paul is citing Pharaoh to show that it's all ultimately foreordained by God and purposeful. It has a purpose in the case of Pharaoh to demonstrate God's power, which it seems to me at least would lend support to the notion that it is doesn't depend at all, not even salvation itself depend on an act of human will or exertion. But that's how I see it, and I want to get how Robert sees it. But before I turn back to Robert, Dan, what do you think Paul is doing by introducing Pharaoh? How does it fit into your larger interpretation of the passage?
So Pharaoh is the opposite side of mercy, right? He's the not mercy sort, and I would limit it probably more down to the hardening. But although the raised up. Robert had some very interesting comments, and maybe he could expand on them. I had previously taken raised up in the sense of it's either one of two ways, allowed to live or survive through the plagues that long, sort of, or the other sense that it could be is maybe made king and put in this position of high authority, so he's very visible, so that the plan of salvation can be got out through him. But I agree with Leighton Flowers' view, Robert. I know you had a discussion with him on the ultimate purpose behind the hardening is some sort of mercy. But where I don't like is his emphasis. I mean, he makes hardening sound so good. It's like, can I be hardened, on Friday? Because it's the nicest thing you can do, right? No. Being hardened is really rough. It's definitely shows a sovereign hand of God. You don't want to be in a position where you're being hardened. It's if the hardening doesn't reverse, you're going to end up in hell. So it's definitely a case of God not showing mercy. But where I think I put a lot of weight on Exodus 3:19. So Exodus 3:19. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. And specifically when Moses initially goes to Pharaoh, he tells him, he reveals who God is, and then he tells him, let my people go. And Pharaoh refuses. He says he doesn't know who God is, and then he's cruel to the Israelites, saying, make bricks without straw. And all of that happens before the hardening aspect. And it's part of the reason why he ends up hardened, but God knew that this would be the case.
Okay, Robert, let me turn it over to you. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so when we look at the verb that Paul uses, and I made the point when Chris and I were walking through the Greek text that Paul differs from the Septuagint and from which is a fairly literal rendering of the Hebrew, and uses the verb exegero, which it can mean a number of different things. BDAG, the standard Greek lexicon for New Testament Greek, has Romans 9:17 listed as cause to appear or bring into being, and it gives a number of references, but it also lists that Romans 9:17 could be something like elevate, like as would be similar to what Dan is saying as far as appointing him as king or putting him in a position of prominence. Obviously, I would make the argument that it means cause to appear, especially when we're comparing it to the other versions of the passage that Paul is quoting from here. Paul is building on those, and he's providing his interpretation of the meaning of Pharaoh's story here as an analogy for what's going on with the people of Israel. And when we look back at that story, it's really fascinating. I've got if we want to get into some of the Hebrew, I've got a number of things on a chart here that kind of show out that the different grammatical forms and what's going on there. But Dan is right. If you look at 3:19, Yahweh says that I know Pharaoh will not let you go, right? So let's just think about this on a practical level. Pharaoh is the most powerful figure on the planet. He is a son of God. He has this slave people who do his bidding for pennies, if that. He just has to keep them going, and he's getting his pyramids built. It says they built the city of Ramesses in the book of Exodus. And so a prophet of a slave people comes to him and says, hey, you need to let us go in the desert to worship our God. Pharaoh's like, well, I'm your God, actually. No, thank you. I'll keep my free labor force. Of course, Yahweh knows that Pharaoh is going to, need to be compelled before he wants to let them go. But then you go on to chapter 4, and Yahweh says in verses 21 and following that I'm not going to let Pharaoh let you go until I'm ready to have Pharaoh let you go, right? So obviously Pharaoh has a hardened heart. Pharaoh would harden his heart. There are a couple instances in the Exodus narrative where it says Pharaoh hardened his heart. Of course he would harden his heart. There's no question about that. Pharaoh hardened his heart. But then as the plagues increase and get worse, and Pharaoh gets to a point where even the most powerful man in the world would yield, realizing that there's something beyond his power at work here, God says, no, I'm not going to let Pharaoh let you go until I'm done. And this is a really interesting text. He says in 4:23, I told you, let my son go and worship me, but you refuse to let him go. Look, I'm about to kill your firstborn son. This is what God is saying is I'm not going to let Pharaoh go. Back up to verse 22. I'm not going to let Pharaoh let you go, Israel, my firstborn, until I've killed his firstborn son. And you think about that, and that is some really harsh, strong stuff, but it's right there in the text. So that is an analogy for Paul for what's going on in the case of Israel. Some Israelites are playing the role of Pharaoh, and they also will end up destroyed because of God's intention to make his name and purpose stand so that he could proclaim it in all the earth. And Paul is citing, I believe it's Exodus 9:16 there in verse 17. Interestingly, a text from Qumran, 1QH, column 7, which is the Thanksgiving hymns, it uses a very, very similar phrase there, a very similar language to what Paul is using there, probably also building on the Exodus account, and which Paul also goes on to use again in the potter clay analogy. It's about God showing his power, making his name proclaimed in all the earth. It uses it in a context about explicit, double predestination, like membership into the covenant or predestined not to be in the covenant and then ultimately to be destroyed. So even though Pharaoh's will obviously was at work, he did not want to obey Yahweh at first. It wasn't advantageous, and would have become advantageous. Yahweh determined that Pharaoh's will isn't what's important. His will is what's important. He was going to harden his heart to see to it that he finished what he intended to do from the get-go, and that's exactly what we see played out, and that makes good sense in Paul's context.
Before I turn back to you, Dan, I just want to find out if I can pull up that portion of the Dead Sea Scrolls. What was the citation again?
Okay, yeah, actually, you know what? I might, hold on a second. We didn't prepare to share screens, but I might have the reference ready to go here. Give me one moment.
No problem. I think you said it was 1QH or 1QS.
Yeah. So it's 1QH and it's column 7. Okay, yeah. So do you want? I have it here. If you want, oh yeah, I need to share my screen, right? Is that going to be simple enough? Let's see here.
I think we can make that work.
Okay, here, let me
go ahead
do
and
that.
share your screen, and we'll see if it.
All right, just a second here. Okay, share screen, and where's the one I want to share? Okay, and start sharing.
I'll let you know when.
Yeah, it should. Are you seeing it now?
Yeah.
Okay, so look right here. So here, I'm going to highlight. Let's see. Well, let me highlight this stuff. Okay. So, but the wicked you created for the time of your wrath from the womb. Hello, back to Jacob and Esau. So that they walk in the way which is not profitable. And here it goes. It says, you have prepared them in order to execute great judgments among them before all your creatures, that they might be a sign eternal, so that all might know your glory and great power, etc. Right? So that's that same language. And then it gets in, I pulled this up to reference when we talk about the potter clay analogy, because it says, how is dust able to determine its step, and that Yahweh is the one who forms the spirit and its activity as he has determined. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. I'm sorry. Here, back up. This is 1QH
Oh,
7:25 to 35. And be careful when you're looking at 1QH. That's the Thanksgiving hymns scroll. Different translations are looking at different ways the text was edited. There's actually an official like scholarly edition, but it's like $500 for the volume. And so the different English translations, there aren't verses, there are columns and lines, and it will always be in column 7, but the lines will vary. So you just need to make sure that you read it in context. It may be difficult to find the references there. So, oh yes, thank you. Yes.
All right.
Am I back?
You are. And Dan, I want to give you the final word on this portion before we move on to the next one. And hopefully I'm able to find 1QH just for my own interest later on. Go ahead. Final thoughts on this one.
So I guess the main reference, obviously, that Paul uses is in 9:16, but I just wanted to back up to verse 15 because I think it's going to be relevant later. So in 9:15, God says, "For by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. But for this purpose I've raised you up to show my power, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." Right? So the essential picture that I take from this is that God could have destroyed Egypt and Pharaoh right away, right? And that's because they were sinful and wicked, and they killed the Hebrew children, all this stuff, right? God could have just judged them and destroyed them, but he doesn't. He waits. He's patient with them. And then the other aspect of the Pharaoh narrative that I'd like to draw out is the fact that hardening is not this wall-to-wall thing. It's on, it's off, it's on, it's off. And Pharaoh himself goes back and forth, back and forth. Yes, you can go. No, you can't go. You can go, but you can't take your children. No, you can't go. And even at one point, it's said that Pharaoh repents, but then he changes his mind again, right? And so Pharaoh basically, I would not take the hardening as theistic determinism, not causal determinism, Chris. Theistic determinism.
Well, neither do Robert and I, though, or at least I don't. I don't think that hardening is a reference to reprobation.
Got it.
Yeah, not in this.
I agree with you, but no. But what I'm saying is, I don't think the passage as a whole is a good case for theistic determinism because it's not wall to wall. So, in any case, where Paul is focused is God's overall plan with respect to Pharaoh, and most specifically in the hardening. And I think what's interesting in Paul's usage is that the snippet that he quotes, "For this purpose I've raised you up so that I might show my power in you," right? That's in verse 17. But look how he sums it up in 18. "So then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills." But in that little snippet, the word hardening isn't there. Right, but Paul has it in view. So Paul is looking at a broader picture of what's going on with Pharaoh in general, and specifically the fact that God's choosing mercy or hardening. Mercy presupposes sin, breaking the Sinaitic covenant, breaking the law. Well, then so does hardening, and that's why I take the hardening here to be judicial.
I know you said you'd give him the last word, and I really want to push back on a couple things.
All right, it's just eating into the time we'll have for the potter clay analogy.
I'll try to be real fast. First, you said that God is being patient with Pharaoh, but God said in 4:21 and following, "I'm not going to let Pharaoh let them go until I've killed his firstborn son." So is God being patient with Pharaoh, like just wanting Pharaoh to like really repent and then God wouldn't destroy him? God said from the get-go that he's going to carry through these entire plagues and kill Pharaoh's firstborn son. I don't think this is a case of God being patient with Pharaoh. I think this is a case of God wanting to use Pharaoh to proclaim his name in the world. Why is Pharaoh the pawn? Because he's the most powerful figure on the planet at the time. If Yahweh manipulates him and uses him to show that he's greater and more powerful than him, it accomplishes that. And then you say that Pharaoh was going back and forth, and there are those couple texts in there that one even says he repented, and one says that he determined to let them go, but then he like immediately reneges on it, right? So the idea is that Pharaoh is trying to save his own skin. This isn't like genuine, sincere repentance, that his heart isn't hardened. This is Pharaoh doing what sinful people do, and trying to manipulate Yahweh and get some relief, and then he reneges on it, shows his true colors like almost immediately. So I just think the whole reading of it, and you interacted in with Beale's article in your response to us. I'd really challenge you to I don't know what your background is with Hebrew grammar, but if you're able to really dig into what he says there about what's going on grammatically, and I've got something I could share with you about that as well. But I just don't think that account of the narrative, big picture, I agree, Paul's looking at the big picture. I just don't think that really does justice even to the big picture.
And I just want to add a couple of observations. Firstly, it seems to me that so sometimes, and I'm not saying this is the case with you, Dan, but sometimes non-Calvinists will say, well, look, sometimes Pharaoh is said to have hardened his own heart. So, clearly some of those choices are Pharaoh's or whatever. But the thing is the very first time that it says anything about Pharaoh's heart becoming hard, it's immediately after God has first said, I will harden his heart. So in 7:3, Exodus 7:3, I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I will multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. And then it's 10 verses later that it says Pharaoh's heart was hardened. So it seems to me as if the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is predominantly the act of God, even before Pharaoh does any hardening of his heart on his own. And then the other thing I wanted to observe is just that the reading that Robert and I have does not at all entail mercy and hardening not being dependent first logically on sin. Yeah. If God foreordains if he chooses in eternity past to whom he's going to show mercy because they are also going to be sinners, that doesn't mean that the mercying isn't nevertheless a sovereign, in the sense that Robert and I mean sovereign, act of God. It doesn't seem to. So I guess I just don't see the point of this repeated emphasis that, hey, mercying and hardening presupposes sin. Yeah, I agree. So what? Yeah. So
I think what Dan is getting at is probably some Calvinists who will use this text, and I think broaden Romans 9 beyond Paul's immediate concern, because and look at this as a pre-creation, forming of certain vessels, that like that sort of thing. And I do think it says a lot that's relevant about predestination, and we can make some inferences. But immediately he's talking about mercy versus hardening of sinful Israel, right? So I don't have a problem with talking about judicial hardening or the fact that sin is presupposed, but I think Dan is probably used to talking about what I would say are some unnuanced Calvinist appeals to this text. So we agree on that point, Dan. But yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. And so there was a lot to respond to, but I'll let you guys have the last word. I'll just say that I appreciate that you agree on the judicial hardening aspect. I think that is going to be important when we look at verse 19.
Okay.
Well, let's get to verse 19 then, because this is where, of course, we get to the hypothetical objector. And as Calvinists, one in particular that I have in mind, of whom I'm a big fan, will very often make the point that, look, if a non-Calvinist objects to a Calvinist reading of the text with the very objection that Paul raises in verse 19, that's an indication that the non-Calvinist critic is not understanding Paul properly, right? So the way it'll often go, or at least the way it's alleged to often go by Calvinists like me, is we'll offer what we take to be a appropriate reading of this text and the Bible as a whole, Calvinistic predestination, and the objector will say, well, but how is that fair, right? How can God hold anybody accountable if He is ultimately the one who has foreordained what they will do, including whether how they will sin and whether they repent? But that is the very objection, it seems to us Calvinists, that Paul is raising on the part of the hypothetical objector here in verse 19, which would seem to us to suggest that, yeah, the very reading that we just offered is the one that Paul is affirming, which is why it prompted the objection, the objection that it did. So if that's not the case, if the hypothetical objector here doesn't lend support to Robert's and my reading, why not? What do you think the hypothetical objection lends support to?
So if I were Pharaoh and I got a copy of Exodus and I started reading it, let's say after the 8th plague or something like that, and I started reading it, and I was like, you mean God is hardening my heart? Yeah, I'm going to complain, right? And that complaint is probably coming from the fact that Pharaoh was a pretty wicked dude to begin with. So even the concept of judicial hardening would raise this sort of question. The way I'd explain it is, let's say the son is responsible to plow a field or something like that, but they get drunk and they fall into a ditch. And so in a drunken stupor in a ditch that they can't get out of while they're drunk, they can't plow the field. Does that mean that the father has to remove that responsibility for him to plow the field? No, it's still the son's fault, even though they can't do it, and that's the concept of judicial hardening. So does that answer your question?
I don't know, Robert. I'm not sure I'm following 100%, but Robert, if you want to respond, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much in this section. So I guess I'd like to ask Dan. So does the hardening preclude? And this is something that I intend to discuss with Leighton Flowers again in the future on his show. We talked about coming on to talk about what hardening means. He seems to think that the hardening, I can't quite understand what the purpose of the hardening is in his point of view, because he almost seems to think that, yeah, even though you're hardened, you could still just repent and believe at any time, and the hardening will go away. And so I want to ask, and if I'm misrepresenting his view, frankly, I don't know that I fully understand it, so I'm not trying to misrepresent his view for any of his fans who might watch the show, or if he does. But Dan, so do you think that the hardening prevents faith as a possibility until the hardening is removed by God?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely, in a sense of it's impossible to believe while you're hardened.
Okay.
I don't think so. I don't think so. So let me put it this way. So it says, why does he yet find fault for who has resisted as well? So there's something irresistible here. Right?
Yes.
So, and it has to do with the hardening. Obviously, it has something to do with hardening. So if God has chosen to harden an individual, they absolutely will be hardened. Right? Okay. That now, what is the hardening? How does it mechanically happen? That's not necessarily in Paul's view here, nor is it the case that he's Paul himself doesn't directly answer your specific question. We'd have to look at some other texts, and frankly, we might not have the exact answer on that.
Okay, so
well, hold on, Robert. Let me interject here for a moment, because this is, I think, a really critical question. Arguably, as and you are indeed arguing this, Dan, it seems to me, this objection, had it been raised by Pharaoh, would be. Your reading would then be plausible. In other words, you, God, hardened me so that I would refuse to do what you wanted me to do. How can you find fault with that if you're the one who hardened me to do it? I could buy that, but the problem is that this portion of the text here is in service to a larger, or to a different question, not why did Pharaoh refuse to let Moses' people go, but rather, why don't and I'm speaking here as Paul, why don't my contemporary Jewish brothers believe?
Yeah.
So it seems to me as if the hardening here is not merely have to do. It doesn't merely have to do with Pharaoh and the people of Israel in Egypt. It has to do with the present Jews in Paul's day that were not believers because God hardened them. But that would seem to contradict what you said a moment ago, which is that hardening doesn't preclude faith. So that's why this seems to me to be a relevant thing here. How were Paul's contemporary Jews hardened in such a way that makes sense in the context of Romans 9, Dan, if hardening doesn't preclude the very faith they don't have?
So you're right. So, well, I think you're right anyways, that the way I would describe it is Paul is warming he's given body shots for the knockout punch to Israel, right? And so he's laying down the principle of this hardening for that purpose, to set him up with what he's going to say later, hint at later in 9, and then make explicit in 11. And in some sense, that's part of Paul's strategy, right? Let's say, for example, he uses kind of these narrative arcs. So the objection in 19, he doesn't totally address immediately in verses 20 through 23. He starts to address it, but he doesn't immediately address it. He lays the foundation, but then he builds a story, and the real answers come in later at the end of chapter 9, right? Because they're seeking righteousness. They're seeking the law through the righteousness. I'm sorry, they're seeking righteousness through the law. And then in chapter 10, that God has his hands extended. In chapter 11, they're cut off because of unbelief. And those are kind of a little more directly answering verse 19 versus the potter clay analogy. I'll grant that, but that's part of Paul's strategy. I think he does something similar with the licenses to sin objection in chapter 6. He initially addresses it, but I wouldn't say that chapter 8 in Romans isn't also dealing with the license to sin objection. If the license to sin objection had come up and Paul started out with the Romans 8:13, if you live after the flesh, you'll die, he could have immediately squashed the license to sin objection at the beginning of 6. But that's not what he does. He wants to get his doctrine out, and he uses this as an occasion to do that. So I think it's more of a narrative arc approach.
Okay, but the question I still have open in my mind is: do you think that Paul's fellow Jews that were not believing, about whom he speaks at the beginning of Romans 9, do you think they were hardened?
Yes.
Okay. What was the result of their hardening? What was the purpose of their hardening? What did their hardening guarantee?
So okay, so the bigger picture strategy is obviously getting the gospel out to the Jews. Just like with Pharaoh, God's name was declared throughout all the earth. So that's the overall strategy. I think you can see that in 11 of the lump in 11. But let's back up and just deal with the more immediate. What is the result? You're absolutely right, Chris, that it kind of locked the Jews into their position of unbelief. Now, whether that was absolute or just made it very, very difficult, I don't think Paul is addressing. But the fact that it moved him in the direction of unbelief and ultimately pushed him to the destruction that happened at the temple in 70 AD, no question that's the case. And God was judging the Jews, but preserving a remnant.
Was it possible? I will turn to you, Robert, in a second. But was it possible, Dan, for Pharaoh? Was it possible, just very, very hard for Pharaoh to let Israel's people go, even when God had hardened him?
I don't know the answer to that, and I don't think that's specifically addressed in the Exodus account. So I'm sorry to punt, but I'm just not sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, here, I'll just say this then. It seems to me really evident, both in Exodus and here in Romans 9, that the hardening of Pharaoh guaranteed, didn't just make it very, very likely that Pharaoh would refuse to let his people go, let Moses' people go. And therefore, in the service of Paul's argument, the hardening of Paul's contemporary Jews likewise produced an inevitable result, it seems to me. And in its context, it seems to me as if the inevitable result is they're not having faith. That seems to be the whole point, to explain not why Paul's fellow Jews were persecuting Christians, which would be consistent with what you're saying, I think, but rather why they don't believe.
So, Chris, let me ask you a question. I know you're the host.
No, please, go ahead.
Why was Pharaoh so wishy-washy? Why did he go back and forth?
Because that was part of God's very plan. Because the going back and forth prolonged the what's the word in a story when the suspense, right? It prolonged the suspense. It gave. It gave more and more and more opportunities for God to display his power. It made the people of Israel feel more and more and more and more hopeless until they realized that they had to fully trust in the power of God and not on man of any sort. So there's a whole host of purposes, but I don't see any reason for thinking that see, it sounds to me as if you're saying that God's hardening Pharaoh's heart was kind of like him pushing down on Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is pushing back up, and sometimes he's having success pushing it up, and then other times he's being pressed under his weight. But that seems to be wholly out of context. It seems to me really clear that the hardening guarantees the purposes that God had in that hardening.
Yeah, and I would say the Pharaoh's wishy-washiness is not that the hardening isn't effective.
Right.
His wishy-washiness is his attempt to get a little fire insurance to bring his head up for some air. And okay, all right, if I say this, maybe Moses will talk his God down a little bit, and he'll lighten up, just a little bit, and I can get out from under this. Like, it's not like sincere repentance. We all know people who say the sinner's prayer because they want hellfire insurance, right? Eternal hellfire insurance, Chris. But and I was thinking that I don't know what Dan's view is on that, but maybe he and I could come and team up on you on that sometime. But
I'll take as many of you on as you need.
I know
the
you would. And then I thought, Chris would be very ready for that. So I don't know. So anyways, but the point is that Pharaoh isn't like sincere, like, oh, I really want to do what God wants me to do. Like, no, he wants to save his skin. He wants to keep his power. So, what the nature of the hardening is not that the hardening is going away or is not being effective. Pharaoh is trying to save his skin. Pharaoh is trying not to get killed by God, and also to hold on to the power that he has and not let God's name be shown to be more powerful than his name. So go ahead.
So I guess I would say that whether the wishy-washiness was the result of the hardening not being absolute, or the hardening relenting at some point, or other, in and out intermittent hardening, one way or the other, there's some back and forth there, and I think that's important. Just Chris, just to make sure, just for the audience, I don't think that God was pushing down on Pharaoh in the sense of he was making Pharaoh evil. That it's not like Pharaoh was a good person and then God is making him evil. The way I would say it is the other way. I'm an Arminian, so in terms of prevenient grace, God is removing his prevenient grace to expose the evil that was already there. I just want to clarify that so I'm not misunderstood.
But just to be clear myself, my point of the pushing up and down picture had nothing to do with whether God was making him evil. It was to illustrate that your conception of hardening seems like a duel of strength, as it were. I'm not being literal here, but between God and Pharaoh, such that God is exerting a certain amount of weight on Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is resisting that with varying degrees of success. And what I'm suggesting is that doesn't seem to fit Romans or Exodus. It seems that the hardening is a matter of sovereignty. It's God's guarantee that Pharaoh will do what God intends for Pharaoh to do.
Okay, so fair enough. I'd say whatever the reason, Pharaoh was wishy-washy.
Okay, but we also, Robert and I, and plenty of other Calvinists also believe that one day the Jewish people are going to embrace their Messiah. So the idea that God can lift his hardening is not a challenge to our reading either.
Oh, no, and I wouldn't. That's not an argument.
Gotcha.
Could I just spell out, positive? We've been putting it to Dan here for a minute.
Yeah.
I'd love to spell out positively what I think is going on beginning in verse 19.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so I think this is one of the places where we can see the problems with the kind of approach that Dan and other Arminian readers interpret. Because if the point is that they are hardened because they didn't believe when they freely could have, the objection in verse 19 doesn't make any sense. Nor does Paul's response, because then the answer to the objection would be, would be what? Well, he can find fault, not because they're not resisting his will, but because they have chosen not to believe. They have not followed the program, as Paul says. So of course they're guilty, but that's precisely the opposite of what Paul says. The objector realizes that what Paul says undermines the possibility for these people whose unbelief Paul is giving account for could have done otherwise, right? So it's impossible that they could have. And then he rebukes the question and appeals to God's right, introducing this potter clay analogy. You have no right to answer back to God. You can't bring God into your courtroom. You can't call him to account. And this is where he brings up the potter clay imagery. He's citing from Isaiah 29 and 45 here to describe the fact that it's foolish and just flat silly for the creature to look at the creator and question his wisdom and right and sovereignty, and that's the language he uses here. The potter has the right, the authority to do what he wants with his clay, and he forms one vessel for honorable use, another for dishonorable use. They're called vessels of wrath, which I take to be a genitive of destination, vessels of wrath prepared for destruction. Chris, this is where I'll draw you into, is that we know that language of destruction is about eschatological judgment, right? Regardless of how we would fill that in differently, that's about eschatological judgment. You can see that throughout Paul's letters, and likewise, so is mercy and glory, right? Those ends, and so I think it's unavoidable here, and I do want to get into we could get into some more points about grammar and also into the Old Testament and Jewish background a little bit more, but that's the point. And just following Paul's rhetoric, even if we disagree about some of the material in the background, following Paul's rhetoric, the objection I don't think makes sense on the kind of reading that Dan would offer, with all love and respect to him and the many Arminian scholars who I respect and learn from. But a reading like ours has a lot more to commend it, and the analogy bears it out. This is a potter doing what he wants with his clay.
Yeah, but I want to focus on the potter clay analogy in a minute, but before we do, I want to make sure that something gets addressed by you, Dan. I'd like to see how you answer this. Robert made a point that I'd never considered before, honestly, which is if the hardening that prompts the objection, who can resist God's will, if that hardening was itself a response to a libertarian free decision on the part of the Jews that Paul has in mind, the libertarian free will to reject Christ, that is, then this objection doesn't even make sense. Why does he still find fault? Because the reason they're hardened in the first place is because of what they did, right? So there would be an obvious answer. The objection wouldn't even make sense, or so it seems to me, which I think is a really powerful point that Robert makes. Before we get into the weeds of the potter clay analogy, and that is where we're about to move, but before we do that, Dan, how would you respond to that? Why couldn't Paul just answer this hypothetical objection, which nobody would raise, it seems to me anyway? Why couldn't he just answer it? He finds fault because you didn't believe, and your hardening that has resulted in everything following your disbelief was the result of your disbelief, and so it's what you deserve. What are your thoughts?
So I think I mentioned that I view this as kind of a narrative arc approach. So he does say that, they're cut off because of unbelief, but he doesn't say it just quite yet. And that's because he has a more pressing concern to deal with, which is the objection is pushing back on God's sovereignty, and he has to dive directly into God's sovereignty. That's a very short answer because I'm eager to get into the text itself, but that's in a nutshell.
Okay. Well, Robert, you spent a few minutes there sort of introducing the potter clay analogy. We had talked in advance about how I was going to give each of you a few minutes to lay out your positive... Sorry? Mute your cell phones.
Yeah, let me make sure mine's muted.
We said in advance I would give each of you a few minutes at this stage to lay out sort of a positive, what your reading is of the potter clay analogy and why you think it is what it is. Did you have more to say on that, Robert? Or
Yeah.
Okay.
if I could real quickly. So there are a couple things in Paul's background going on here. So one, we have Day of the Lord motif, and you can see that specifically when he says that these are vessels of wrath and vessels of mercy prepared either for destruction or for glory. Compare that with Romans chapter 2 and some other eschatological language that Paul deals with in the Old Testament background. There's a book called The Righteous and Merciful Judge that deals with Paul's use of this Day of the Lord motif, and it has a really helpful treatment of Romans 9 on that I commend. I forget the authors' names. It's two authors, but I could give that to you later. And then Paul, in order, when he responds to the objector, in order to introduce this in verse 20, who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder? This is the introduction of the potter clay analogy. Why have you made me like this? Paul quotes really what most scholars think is sort of like an amalgamation of Isaiah 29:16 and 45:9. And when you read those texts in their context, I think that they're about what God is doing through the nation Israel, for the revelation of his sovereignty into the world. But it includes they're being blinded and they're being judged ultimately, in part to be realized in an eschatological judgment. And through all that, God is taking creating the kingdom and taking it into the world. That's different from some of the other language that we get with the imagery of potter and clay, or more narrowly about vessels in places like Jeremiah 18 and 2 Timothy chapter 2. I think those texts get appealed to without very good appreciation for their context. So if Dan goes there, we can follow up on that. And also when we see that this was an important motif in the Second Temple Jewish literature, and Paul can be compared and contrasted with those, and that becomes very, very instructive. So in the Wisdom of Solomon, it's used to describe idolatry, which is clearly not what Paul's talking about here. It's not God as the potter, it's idolaters as potters, and clay as what they make their idols out of. But in texts like Sirach 33, which I've published on, it's talking about what God does at creation, and so that gives a broader application to it than just Israel. And it says that all human beings are like clay in the hands of God the potter. He gives them whatever they decide. Multiple scholars I could cite say this means that he determines their destinies, and it's part of a structure in creation. There's this what's called the doctrine of opposites, where he creates good and evil, life and death, sinner and godly. They're all the works of his hand as creator. And we see this imagery. We already looked at some material from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I would point to additional material which talks about God forming human spirits and destinies and bringing them into the faith. And it's all according to his good pleasure. We get language like according to his purpose, according to the purpose of election. We get the language of according to his good pleasure in Ephesians as well. Paul is actually taking up these phrases that are distinctive in these predestinarian Second Temple texts. I'm not saying he's literarily dependent upon them, but he's working in their theological orbit in a lot of fascinating ways. And I've got some texts here that if we want, I can put up some primary texts after Dan offers a response. But a lot of scholars, and what's interesting is it's not Calvinist scholars who are saying this, but scholars like Megan Broshi, who is a Jewish scholar who died this year, an archaeologist, big name in the work on the Dead Sea Scrolls. He says that there's no question that the Essene ideology influenced Paul's predestinarian and election language. We don't know how that happened. We can't put that together. But this sort of Jewish predestinarian thinking is just so very, very clear. David Flusser was another Jewish scholar who I'd point to, who made this very forcefully in his publications. He died a while ago. So anyways, I hope that was coherent.
Okay. All right, Dan, you take a few minutes to likewise spell out how you read the potter clay analogy and why you think it should be read that way. And then I'll try to get us going into a more back and forth discussion.
Sure. So let's see. So I'll start in verse 20. But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like thus? And Robert is absolutely correct that he's referring to Isaiah 29. There, basically what was happening, I guess, there was the Assyrians were going to invade, and they're hiding. Some of the Jews are hiding the plans to ally with Egypt from God, and that's crazy, and they shouldn't be doing that. And so that's where the potter clay analogy is and comes in Isaiah 29. And Robert is absolutely right that there's blindness, but it also says later, I think in Isaiah 29, that the blindness will reverse, and as it will here in Romans 11, we'll see that the hardening will reverse. If Israel's blindness will reverse, just like it does in 29. Okay, so then verse 20, it seems like Paul is borrowing language from wisdom. I'm not 100% certain on that, but I'm fairly certain because there's so much verbal overlap. But he says he's going to basically lay out the analogy, and then 22 and 23 are going to apply the analogy. So has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? And so that's the analogy. This is actually talking about a potter, but he's saying God is like this potter. And then what if God, desiring to show his wrath and make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? So there's vessels of wrath, right? And then God prepares those vessels of wrath for destruction, and then he has patience and endures them with much patience. And he does this, why? In verse 23, in order to make known the riches of his glory to the vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory. So the core concepts that I'd like to bring out here is that they're vessels of wrath first, and then they're prepared for destruction. So the wrath is wrath at sin, and it does in the future will be eschatological wrath, but in the interim, it's wrath that God is holding back his judgment on, but he's mad at them, and he's mad at them because of sin. And so it's very much like the mercy language that we saw in about Moses, and also in verse 18, where I put a pretty strong emphasis on the fact that they were sinners, and that's the reason why God has wrath on them. He's mad at them because of sin, or he has mercy on them even though they're sinners, right? They're vessels of mercy, which is mercy on their sins. He has wrath because of sin. And so I take this as judicial, but I also take it as something that is reversible and can change. You can see that in the reference to Hosea. So it goes on, even though he's called not from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. Indeed, as he says to Hosea, those who are not my people I will call my people, and those who are not beloved I will call beloved. Right? That they switch categories from not beloved to loved. Right? So they switch categories in the potter clay words. That would be they switch from vessels that were vessels of wrath to vessels of mercy, and we can also see that in Romans chapter 11, but we don't have to go there. So for me, obviously, what is going to be key that I'd like to drill into is this whole concept of patience. We talked a little bit about it with respect to Pharaoh, but here Paul says that God is patient and holding back, patient or long-suffering, even though he wants to show his wrath. He's patient with these vessels of wrath that he's prepared for destruction. Well, what's the point of this patience? And so here I'm going to switch up and go to an odd place. You wouldn't expect me to go here, but to 2 Peter, or maybe you do know exactly what I'm doing. But this is 2 Peter chapter 3, and this is, I'll start in verse 15, and count the patience of our Lord as salvation, just as our beloved brother Paul also wrote to you according to the wisdom given to him, as he does in all his letters when he speaks in them of these matters, right? There are some things that are hard to understand, which the ignorant twist to their own destruction, as they do other scriptures. So obviously, Peter is familiar with Paul's writings. He's read them, and he's talking about God's patience, just as our beloved brother Paul also wrote to you. Well, Paul talks about patience at least 2 times. One is in Romans chapter 2, where he's talking about God's patience leading us to salvation, but the other one is here in Romans 9. And Peter uses the same word for patience or long-suffering that Paul does. And he's also saying it's a very difficult passage to understand, which Romans 9 is a very difficult passage to understand. Romans 2 is a little simpler. So my guess is that he's talking about this passage. And so if you look at Peter's overall context, he's talking about that God is withholding his judgment on the ungodly, holding the destruction of the ungodly. And then verse 9 obviously is a core verse for the SEA society, right? The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, but as some men count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. And so Paul is a genius, right? And geniuses sometimes are hard to understand and sometimes often get misunderstood. So you can see that in like 2 Thessalonians, where he's correcting some of the things that maybe were misunderstood in 1 Thessalonians. In 2 Corinthians, maybe he's correcting some things that went wrong from the reading of 1 Corinthians. Even in Romans, there's, Paul's basically saying, hey, some people are misrepresenting me by saying that, it's a license to sin and this sort of thing. So there's several cases where Paul genius isn't completely understood, and here Peter, I think, is basically saying, yep, Paul's super complicated, he's hard to understand, and some people are making mistakes here, but count this patience of the Lord as salvation. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promises, some men count slowness, but his patience for you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should be brought to repentance. So in a nutshell, I don't differ too much from, like, let's say, for example, Cranfield are done in their commentaries on this specific aspect. So it's a hardening, but it's a hardening that can and does reverse. Sometimes people change categories from vessels of wrath to vessels of mercy.
Okay. I want to give Robert a chance to respond to some of those things. There's a whole lot that I want to say, but I'm the host, not the guest. So, but there is one thing I want to push back on. But before I push back on it, I want to ask you, Dan, this question. When you said that these vessels of wrath were vessels of wrath first and then prepared for destruction, how important is that to your argument?
So
you made the claim, if I understood you correctly, that the vessels of wrath in verse 22 were vessels of wrath, and therefore, or at the very least, and then were prepared for destruction. And my question for you is, how important is that sequence of events to your reading?
Not vital. So, but let me see if I understand. So, it's the vessels of wrath are the ones that are prepared for destruction. Am I missing that? That's in 22.
No, you're not missing that, but that also, the way you've just said it, doesn't have the sequential language that you used earlier. So the prepare for destruction is in the perfect tense, so it's completed before the action of the main verb, which would be the enduring or the long suffering. So the preparation for destruction precedes the enduring, the vessels of wrath, the patience on them. So what is important in terms of timing is that they're prepared for destruction before God has patience on them. That sequence of event is vital. Okay. Well, that's actually the right sequence of events, it seems to me. But what doesn't seem to me is what you said earlier, which is that they were vessels of wrath before they were prepared for destruction. It seems to me that the reason they're vessels of wrath is because they were prepared for destruction.
So what does God prepare for destruction? The vessels of wrath.
Right.
Am I wrong? Am I wrong about that?
But the vessels of wrath are individuals. Yeah, they're the ones. Yeah. They're the ones he created. Out of clay. But remember the point of or how whatever sort of meta analysis we make of the potter clay analogy, at the very least, what it illustrates is that a people or persons are prepared for a particular use. Right, they're made with a purpose, and that purpose, according to verse 22, for some is destruction, and it's for that reason that the ones so prepared for destruction are vessels of wrath. That is their purpose.
So this isn't a linguistic; it's more a theological point. But I'm very concerned about what you just said. So make sure. Let me make sure I don't misrepresent you because it's so important. But I believe that God is only gets mad at people because of sin. Do you disagree with that?
No.
Okay, good. I'm very glad I didn't misunderstand you there.
Sure.
Okay.
But
All right.
nevertheless, God, according to at least my belief in meticulous divine providence and all the rest of Calvinism, God prepares vessels for the purpose of, or at least in this context, for the purpose of showing them wrath. Now, he's not mad at them prior to their sinning, but he prepares them to be the sinners they are with the purpose of demonstrating his wrath. That's
Okay,
it.
so he.
And if I'm
Sorry,
right about, really quick, let me just finish my thought. And if I'm right about that, then prepared for destruction doesn't follow their being vessels of wrath. They go hand in hand. They are prepared for destruction because they are vessels of wrath, or vice versa. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, so here's where I think I'll bring back in the language itself, and I'll push back a little, just a hair, on Robert's point of the genitive of the eschatological genitive of the wrath is the wrath of destruction itself. So because the reason why, yes, the wrath is going to be unleashed in hell in eschatological judgment, but the patience, the wrath is there. And I think verbally, the wrath is there, but God is holding back the actual manifestation of the wrath. And I think verbally we can establish that point.
Okay, and I'm not sure I follow, but Robert, I've been doing a lot of talking now.
Yeah.
What are some thoughts you have on what Dan had to say?
Okay, so first, when we pay careful attention to what it means when Paul says, as the ESV renders it, I think is pretty good in verse 22, that God has endured with patience vessels of wrath prepared for destructions. It does not say that he's patient with them. It says he endures them with patience, and that is, to me, it sounds a lot like what we get in Romans 3:25 and 26, where God in his divine forbearance had left sins previously committed unpunished, right? So God has foresight. He puts up with them, but it doesn't mean that he is being patient to them as though he just really wants to have mercy on them if they would just repent and remold themselves and become vessels of mercy prepared for glory. So I don't think that works, and so also that means the connection to 2 Peter 3. He says that God's patience is for you, his audience, right? So however we would spell out the exegetical details there, it's an interesting text. I wouldn't be prepared to defend one interpretation over another, but the patience there has an object. It is you, the people who Peter expects to read this letter. That's different from here. The patience here is not the vessels of wrath. So we can talk about God's patience towards the Christian community. That's different from him enduring with patience vessels of wrath. Second, you said you think that the background here might be wisdom of Solomon. That just can't be the case, Dan, with all love and respect. If you read that text, Wisdom of Solomon 15, verses 7 and 8, of course, the potter needs with soft earth, clay, and he fashions different kinds of vessels, some for clean use and some for contrary use. Verse 8, with misspent toil, these workers form feudal gods from the same clay. He's talking about idolatry. He's not talking about God's activity in forming human beings. He doesn't draw that analogy whatsoever, regardless of the fact that he uses the language of potter and vessels. And that's not how we do exegesis. That's not how we determine backgrounds and literary influences by counting up the commonality of words. We need to examine more critically the themes of the text, the meaning, to see whether it actually works with what Paul is saying. And in comparing Wisdom of Solomon and Romans 9-11 in an important essay, John Barclay made this comment. He said, one could hardly ask for a more brutal or more direct attempt to undermine the moral and rational foundation in which wisdom had built its reading of history. Barclay's not a Calvinist, but he recognizes that Paul's polemic in Romans 9-11 is like the polar opposite of the Wisdom of Solomon's polemic in his broader context. So then when we go and look, and I don't know if I could share my screen here real quick. I think it might be helpful just to
yeah, go for it.
Just so readers can see. I think it's so important to look at primary text. So let me just blow this up here. Can you see that? It's my Word document right here. Okay, so this is where I think we find more promising background to Paul's language, specifically with when we get to verse 13. This is Sirach 33. Like clay in the hands of the potter to be molded as he pleases. And this language, as he pleases, is very much like language that Paul uses here in Romans 8 and 9 and in other discourses that talk about divine election. And this is about what God does at creation. So he creates. That's how it concludes. Look at the works of the Most High; they come in pair, the opposites of the other. God has created in such a way, and this is a wisdom motif. You can see this in the biblical wisdom. You can see it in Ecclesiastes, but also in Proverbs 16:4, where it says that God has created the wicked for destruction. Right. So the nature of creation in divine wisdom, in wisdom literature, is such that God has created so that there would be these opposites. This is just a fundamental fact of the way that God has created. And then when we get into some of the literature in the Dead Sea Scrolls, I'm scrolling down here. This is from the Community Rule 1QS 11-22. It talks about God's mercies, and drawing near to his mercies, etc. Makes some references, I think, also to the Exodus material. And if I scroll down just to my underlined portion here, he says, for without you, no behavior is perfect, and without your will, nothing comes to be. You have taught all knowledge, and all that exists is so by your will. Beyond you, there is no one to oppose your counsel or understand any of your thoughts, gaze into the abyss of your mysteries. This should sound like the conclusion that Paul draws in Romans 11. And then he goes on to say, who can endure your glory? What indeed is the Son of Man among your marvelous deeds? What shall be one born of woman be considered in your presence? Shaped from dust, has he been maggots' food? Shall be his dwelling? They have a very colorful, pessimistic anthropology at Qumran. But molded clay, for dust is his longing. What will the clay reply to the one shaped by hand? And what advice will he be able to understand? Doesn't that sound like what Paul is? They're both alluding back to Isaiah here, and this is very much what Paul is saying as well. We can get into some more. I don't want to take all this. This is 1QH. You have formed the spirit and activity you have determined. There are others as well that we could cite from the Qumran material. So all that to say, Paul's use of the potter clay analogy is much closer than these more deterministic sounding texts. It's absolutely nothing like what we get in wisdom, where it's talking about the futile working of idol makers out of clay. Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes, sir.
Just say, as sort of obviously a biased hearer of what Robert was saying, it does strike me that what Paul is saying sounds an awful lot more like what we read in Sirach 33 and in that Qumran scroll. So just one more, I'll reiterate for the viewer's sake. Ben Sirach says in Sirach 33, verse 13, as the clay is in the potter's hand to fashion it at his pleasure, so man is in the hand of him that made him to render to them as liketh him best. And then in that Qumran scroll 1QS 11:22, man is molded clay, for dust is his longing. What will the clay reply and the one shaped by hand? So it does strike me as those two are closer to both Paul's quotation and his and the context than Wisdom of Solomon and some other texts in which a non-Calvinist reading might be a little bit more plausible. What do you have to say in response to that? In response to the seeming, at least, similarities between this analogy and Sirach and the Qumran scroll?
Okay, so I'd say one of these things is not like the other. I do respect Sirach quite a bit, pardon me, and it was originally published as part of the Apocrypha by Protestants, and it's obviously in the Orthodox canon and the Roman Catholic canon, and it's very valuable material. So, in some sense, I would, I guess, make the effort to make a stand that the Wisdom of Solomon is not saying what you think you are arguing that it's saying. So I can get into specifics, but I should switch gears and say I don't see the Qumran has the same status. It's not in anyone's canon, and not only that, it's wasn't well received by the Jews themselves. And the leader of Qumran was this the quote unquote teacher of righteousness, basically claimed to be a prophet, and he was receiving revelation directly from God, and he was the infallible interpreter of the Hebrew scriptures and this sort of thing. And both the Jews and the Christians and the church father, no one recognized him as a prophet. No one saw this stuff as inspired. So I'm much more leery there. I'd say specifically on Qumran, the things that and hey, let me take a step back. You guys are scholars. I'm not. But there is this sort of queasiness that people have about this sort of thing, and what we see. Let's say, for example. I read their commentary on Habakkuk, and the thought of the just shall live by faith. This leader of the Essenes basically said this refers to me, and that means you have to believe me, right? And that's stuff like that really makes us nervous. And more to the point, more specifically to the passages you quote. When I looked at them, so this is I guess 1QH 7, 9, 15, 17. All of them basically talk about theistic determinism. Sorry, Chris, no, I almost said causal. Theistic determinism, but they all lead in or sum it up with that God was directly revealing to them these marvelous mysteries, right? And he's not necessarily arguing this from the Hebrew scriptures, at least directly. He's saying that God is telling him this stuff, and not only that, in the Qumran location, they found stacks of horoscopes, and several scholars said that they linked this fatalism to the stars and the rotations of the planets, and that they were using it to predict the future. So when you get into stuff like this, okay, I get very, very nervous.
Okay, but Dan, but let me make something clear. Neither Robert nor I, nor any other New Testament scholar that thinks the Qumran literature lies in the or is formative in the or influences the theology of the New Testament. None of us are saying that the Dead Sea Scrolls are authoritative, or even necessarily that Paul and other authors of the New Testament saw it as such. All we're saying is that in the Second Temple Judaism, and its literature that was the backdrop to the writing of the New Testament, that influenced the thinking to one degree or another of the authors of the New Testament and the people spoken of therein. When we look at the phrases and idioms that New Testament authors use, when we look at the theology reflected therein, we have to look at all of the bodies of literature, all the bodies of thought that would have contributed to the thinking that produced that writing, and one such element in that influence would have been this Qumranic material. That doesn't mean that it's authoritative or that we should believe it by just full stop. It's just saying it influenced the writing of the New Testament in certain ways. And I don't think there's any controversy over the fact that the Qumranic material has influenced the writing of the New Testament. And if that's true, then that seems to negate your entire response that you just offered to the Qumran scroll. What do you think?
I think it is a very important historical background. It's very useful for setting the context. But what I am concerned with is, and I'm not saying you're doing this, but is reading Qumran theology too much into the New Testament? That's where I would push back. I think you could. Anyways, I'm very comfortable drawing the line the other direction. Paul is saying this, and it looks like what's being talked about in Qumran.
Yeah.
What I don't like is, here's this big level concept in Qumran, and we're going to read that into Paul. In some sense, and I'm not saying you guys are doing this, but the Essenes were determinists, and that would be reading determinism into the text of the New Testament, which we just shouldn't do.
Well, let me follow up with it. So, you made the point about canon and authority, and we're not saying that, the idea of a canon is almost sort of a modernistic concept in some ways. Like, nobody walked around with a leather-bound Bible, some of which had the Apocrypha in it and some of it didn't in Paul's day, right? So there were a lot of different ways that authority worked. You had obviously the divinely inspired, Hebrew Bible that was uncontroversial, but even then the Sadducees didn't accept the prophetic books, right? And so even that was in flux in some ways from Jewish place to Jewish place. The way we might think about the way the Qumran texts can work, other like pseudepigraphical texts that we know were majorly influenced on the New Testament, such as the Enochic literature and other apocalyptic literature, is almost like the way that this is an analogy I came up with. I don't know how helpful it'll prove to be, but the doctrinal statement on your church website, right? Like, that tells us something about the way that you interpret the Bible, right? So you don't hold it as the Bible, but it tells us about how you interpret the Bible, right? And so a lot of Jewish traditions worked that way in the Second Temple period. There were different schools of interpretation, and Josephus talks about these as three philosophies, and there are two issues that he raises to. And you should read Josephus when you get a chance. There are two issues that he highlights as the basis for differences of opinion among these Jewish philosophies. One is the nature of resurrection and the afterlife. The other is predestination and free will. These are the things that were the big hot button issues. And the reason why then that's so helpful is we can lay out these sources and say, oh, okay, here we have what look to be Essene sources, the Dead Sea Scrolls and other texts that seem deterministic. Here we have what might be strongly, free will affirming texts, and some that are kind of nebulous, right? Like with some of the Pharisaical literature. But now let's look at Paul and say, where does he fit in these? So, for example, in other places in Sirach, and I should make this point, Sirach is not a thoroughgoing deterministic text. I think it's got deterministic themes, and I think it's broadly deterministic, but it's nothing like what we get in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I'm a little unique in my reading of Sirach. I can quote other scholars with me, but it has these overt affirmations of free will. Paul has the opposite in Romans 9. It does not depend on the one willing, right? And elsewhere, I think Paul will talk a lot about what men cannot do and never about the power of the choice. Paul never has anything like that anywhere in his writings. But then he has these really distinctive phrases and idioms and analogies, like the potter clay analogy, that we only see elsewhere used that way in these deterministic texts. A fun thing to do would be to compare the doxology or hymn in Ephesians 1 to some of those Thanksgiving hymns in 1QH, and it's amazing to see how many concepts and themes that he takes over that are like distinctively sectarian. Like he throughout his letters, he talks about us as the children of light versus those who are in darkness. That is like not found anywhere else, but in this apocalyptic, deterministic kind of material that we get in the Second Temple period. So there's just so much work there that can be done. I really want to challenge you to go back and look at the relevance of some of this material, not in a way of suspicion. I don't think the way you're understanding the function of the teacher of righteousness is quite right. There's a lot of secondary literature you could read on this. I could point you to some stuff, but what we're doing with comparative literature is, or these comparisons is trying to figure out whose expressions, linguistic, contextual, thematic, and all sorts of other things does Paul's writing most look like. The differences are probably more important than the similarities. And so Paul is not just like a Qumran Essene. I wouldn't even say that we could argue that Paul read the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? I don't think there's any way to prove that historically, but that he was influenced by an ideology like what we find there, that I would say is indisputable. And I'm not alone on that. And so anyways, we can go back.
Let me ask you one question, Robert.
Yeah.
So the teacher of righteousness basically claimed to be receiving word from God, revelation from God.
Yeah.
Was he a right? So yes.
Yeah.
So, and I think Paul did, and I think the teacher of righteousness did not. So, do you think that the teacher of righteousness was receiving revelation from God? Was he a true prophet or a false prophet?
So they like the early Christians, saw themselves as an eschatological community. They, unlike only they and the Christians talk about being in the new covenant. Only they and the Christians talk about themselves, forming this remnant, of eschatological Israel, as opposed to those outside. So there are a lot of very fascinating analogies there. I would have to examine the specific, like some specific quotes about what he's saying. There were lots of people, and the concept of a prophet is not exactly what a lot of modernistic understandings of what a prophet is. They saw themselves as inspired interpreters. There's no question about that. And so in some sense, it was far less divine than what we imagine when we talk about a prophet. So, if you press me, I'd have to say, I could probably show you some areas where I'd say this guy was a mistaken false prophet or whatever. It doesn't mean from that the community got nothing right theologically, and it seems still that the early Christians, just as they took over concepts and ideas from Pharisaic Judaism, because they came out of that soil. It was a Jewish movement. They carry over some ideas and they baptize them into Christ, and that comes to shape their theology as an entity in and of itself. So we have to try to be more objective and more historical rather than making judgments about, we can't look at that because there's some heretical or false prophecy stuff going on over there. There may very well have been, but that's not historical analysis. We have to try to be dispassionate in some ways to be a little more objective about what's happening there.
Oh, no, I disagree. I mean, we should be very passionate about putting down false prophets. And now, in the context of reading them as, well, this is a false prophet and here's what he had to say. Yes, it's very interesting historically, but I think that, like I said, it can give you great background and context for what Paul is saying, but it really does move away, and it's very different than Sirach. So we probably should...
Well, let me follow up before we wrap up, because actually we're close to where I have to end. But okay. I'm a little bit troubled by the notion that if somebody's a false prophet, everything they say must be dismissed. I'm not saying that's what you're saying, but it is what it sounds like you're saying. And look, the Watchtower organization that heads the Jehovah's Witnesses, they're the equivalent of a false prophet, and yet they teach monotheism. Should we reject monotheism because Jehovah's Witnesses, led by the Watchtower organization, are monotheists? I mean, so the point that I'm getting at is, even if the founder of the Essene community is a false was a false prophet, nevertheless, the writings of the Essene community, the thoughts, the way of thinking captured in the writings of the Essene community, has clearly and indisputably influenced the writing of the New Testament in places, and I see no reason for thinking that we should reject it all just because allegedly that one person was a prophet.
And one more historical point real quick. there's a really good book called Beyond the Essene Hypothesis by Gabriel Boccaccini. He's a professor at the University of Michigan. And he shows, and I should make this point, Essenism is much bigger than Qumran. So not every Essene would have been a follower of the teacher of righteousness or whatever. So what we get, most scholars believe, what we get at Qumran is sort of, one of the most extremist, probably one of the most extremist fringe parts of the movement. But they do have some literature, including the Treatise on the Two Spirits, which is a very important predestinarian text, that was probably a summary of what the broader Essene movement came to believe. So even if I say, get rid of the teacher of righteousness, you still have broader Essenism that would have been an ideology on the table for Paul. And Josephus and other historical sources, they have nothing but praiseworthy words for the Essenes. They didn't regard them as a bunch of heretics. They commend their godliness and their lifestyles if you look at those sources. So I just don't think that works at all.
Okay, so just to respond real quickly. So let's say 2,000 years from now, someone finds a printed out version of Robert's blog, and they also find the Book of Mormon, right? And yes, there's true things in the Book of Mormon, but if they start to interpret Robert's blog in light of the Book of Mormon, that's a problem, right? And Robert, you'd be the first person to object to that. Right, and so that's the concern I have now. Like once you recognize, yes, it's a false prophet, and as we should be protecting the flock of God and that sort of thing. But in that context, in light of this being false prophecy, yes, we can start to find whatever true parts we can and helpful bits that we can. But we have to be very cautious, and Sirach is not that way. Okay. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and I'm going to let you have the final word on that, Robert. You and I both would have more to say, I'm sure. And indeed, maybe we could do a round 3 if you guys are interested. We'll talk about that offline. But as I've got to go in a few minutes, I want to bring things to a close, at least on this part 2, and do what I did last time, which is, again, give you each just a minute or two to give some a parting message of sorts, some final thoughts that you'd like people to be thinking about after they've watched today's recording. And then offline, we can talk about the possible part 3. So Robert, your 1 to 2 minute final thoughts.
Sure. Keep reading, keep studying, and this is for the audience. I know Dan's going to do that. But the deeper I go, the longer I look at it, the more information I find, and it shows me that I was wrong about some things that I assumed, and it reinforces other things that I believed. Study Greek, so that you don't have to take the opinions of scholars, and so that you're not subject to confirmation bias in the use of your sources. Do historical exegesis. Learn about the Second Temple Jewish background and the debates that Paul was moving into. We are really blessed to have a wealth of information available to us. Get off the internet, get some books, get in the library, look at some real good sources by credentialed, published, peer-reviewed scholars, and do the hard work of learning these ancient dead languages, so that you can learn what Paul had to say here, but not just on this issue, on all sorts of other issues. Bringing in what Paul says here, I think in Romans 9-11, he's getting back behind justification to explain Israel's unbelief. And when he does that, he talks about God's free and unconditioned mercy. He talks about God's naming call that marks out the people of God, marks out the faithful remnant, and it was done without regard to any human conditions. Paul is emphatic about that, not the one who wills, not the one who strives, but God who has mercy. He has mercy on whom he will, and he hardens whom he will, etc. The call creates out of those who are not his people, it creates his people. And so all that is what I think Paul is driving at here, in order to say that God is doing all this to reveal his glory in the name of Jesus to the world, to bring in the fullness of the Gentiles, and he will effectively save a remnant of Israelites in the future. But all of that is undergirded by this assumption of a sovereign divine determinism that I think Paul lays out on the table for us here in this beautiful magisterial section of his most important letter to the Romans. So.
All right, thanks, Robert. Dan, your 1 or 2 minute final thoughts as well.
Yes, thank you. So, and thank you guys for excellent discussion. I really appreciate you guys. So, Paul, Romans 9 is extremely complicated. When I was first challenged by a Calvinist on it, I accepted Calvinism because I didn't quite understand Romans 9, frankly. But when I was presented with a Calvinistic interpretation, it made some sense of the text, and so I didn't have anything else to go by, and it was just confused by it. It is hard to understand, but I think that is exactly what Peter's point is, and then Peter is kind of laying out that God does want to save everybody, and that God's patience is a showing of mercy. God does have wrath. Let's take him seriously. He is sovereign. You don't want to be in a position where you're hardened. Right? He has wrath on sin. He can also have mercy on sin. And if you turn to his son, God will have mercy on you. So thank you very much.
Well, those are great. I appreciate that. And I'll offer a final thought as well and just say that I think the kind of discussion that the three of us have been having for a grand total of something like a little over 3 hours now, and may indeed continue into a part 3, is exactly the kind of conversation that Christians who disagree on an important topic like this should carry out their conversations. I far too often see, both in the Calvinism, non-Calvinism debate and in other debates, the hell debate, the tongues debate, and a host of other debates, I see Christians really tearing each other apart and going into conversations like these with little to no intention beyond proving the other person wrong. And I get the genuine sense that all three of us are here with a genuinely open mind and heart, willing to hear each other out, not wanting to defend a particular position, but rather to work together as Christians to try to figure out what God has inspired Paul to write. And I think that's really commendable, and I think that we have had a conversation and may continue the conversation in a way that should hopefully model the kind of charitable, loving, brotherly conversations that we as Christians should be able to have where we disagree. And so I just want to thank both of you, Robert and Dan, for helping me to make that kind of conversation possible, and for helping me to model healthy, charitable debate between Christians for our viewers. And I look forward to continuing the discussion one way or another. Both of you, thanks again for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, well, I hope that you enjoyed that. Those of you who have stuck around for the entire discussion. For whatever it's worth, we are not planning to do a round 3. We think that we covered all the important material on Romans 9 in the 3.5 roughly hours that the three of us talked. But I do hope to have Robert and Dan on possibly at different times, whatever, to discuss other passages, as well as other Calvinist and non-Calvinist guests. So stay tuned for those in the future. But rest assured, not every episode of Theopologetics is going to be about the Calvinism, non-Calvinism debate. As I said, 2 weeks from today, I'll present my amillennialist reading of the 1,000 years discussed in Revelation chapter 20. It's probably not the amillennialist reading that you're familiar with, and it's, I think, superior to both the more typical amillennialist reading and the premillennialist one. So tune in 2 weeks from today, which will be November 30th, Monday, November 30th at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. And I'll look forward to covering that topic with you. And as I said in the beginning of this episode, if you want to get early access to the recordings from the Rethinking Hell conference a week ago, go to patreon.com/rethinkinghell and sign up to be a patron. And please do keep me in your prayers as I try to land a publisher for the book project hold on. Oh, Robert's asking, I'm interested in that. Are you with Beale or did you go another direction? I'm not sure what you mean, Robert. Can you elaborate? Do you mean... Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean. Do you mean that book project that I mentioned? Let me know. But while I'm waiting for Robert to explain what he means by the question he asked in the chat, please do pray for me in this book project that I'm hoping to find a publisher for. I plan to send out proposals beginning this coming Friday, beginning with IVP Academic. And I'm optimistic, but not at all confident, that IVP Academic will pick it up. And if it does, then when that happens, I'll be able to announce details. So hopefully hopefully that materializes, and I appreciate your prayers. I'm still not seeing, Robert, your clarification in the chat when you said you're interested in that. Are you with Beale, or do you go another... Oh, okay, you're asking about my amillennialist reading. Right. So Beale, and I would say the vast majority of amillennialists, think that the first resurrection in Revelation chapter 20 refers to martyred Christians going to heaven, the intermediate state, disembodied when they die. And then the second resurrection, or alternatively, that it refers to the fact of regeneration, the regeneration in which God takes out the Christian's former heart of stone and replaces it with a heart of flesh. So those are the two typical amillennialist readings. It either refers to regeneration or to Christians reigning in the intermediate state until the 1,000 years is over. And then the second resurrection, amillennialists recognize, is a bodily resurrection. So you've got some sort of spiritual resurrection in the first resurrection and bodily resurrection in the second resurrection. That's precisely why I think that that amillennialist reading is the least likely of all the millennial views readings of Revelation 20. And I'll get into that more when I present my reading in a couple of weeks from now. I don't want to say, honestly, what my amillennialist reading is right now, because I want to offer my full case for it, and I don't want to let the cat out of the bag. So hopefully, Robert, you'll forgive me for that, but just know that no, I do not take the reading of Beale or any other amillennialist who thinks that the first resurrection is a reference either to regeneration or to reigning with Christ disembodied in the intermediate state. I think there's an even better reading than that, one that does far better justice to the text, even than premillennialism as well. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a teaser. Robert, you come back in 2 weeks to watch this show to find out. Again, that's Monday, November 30th at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, and I will look forward to having you all back then. Thank you so much for joining me, and for those of you who have tuned in live or watched the episodes after they've been fully streamed and are available on the channel, and you've been doing that for multiple episodes, thank you so much. Please, if you enjoy what you see, click the like button and subscribe and spread the word around. I hope to continue to do this and get it back up to the kind of popularity that the Theopologetics podcast was before I stopped doing the podcast several years ago. So spread the word, and if you would like to have me cover a particular topic or have some particular guests on or something like that, then just shoot me an email at the email address on your screen, theopologetics@hotmail.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. God bless. I've been your host, Chris Date, and thanks so much for watching Theopologetics, where we think together through what we believe, why we believe it, and not something else. If you've enjoyed this episode, please click the thumbs up, like icon, the subscribe button, and the bell icon to receive notifications when new videos are streamed or uploaded. Either way, come back in 2 weeks for the next episode of Theopologetics, streaming live on YouTube every other Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific. Until then...